many probably know this, but maybe not everyone does. Jamstack at least used to stand for JavaScript APIs and Markup, JAM. And who hasn't built a website with just JavaScript APIs and markup? That doesn't seem like a great term because like every website I've ever built in the last 20 years involved JavaScript APIs and markup.
Well, I think Jamstack is an established community that's going to stick around. But if we don't kind of rein it in and put some bounds to what it means, then it's just this goofy buzzword for modern web development. And there's probably a better way to describe those things. And so what I did was I went back to the early days and thought, well, we know Netlify coined that term. And so it was definitely, and to a good extent today, still tightly coupled to the Netlify product offering. But like, what did that idea give us? It gave us sites that were more secure, easier to scale. We talked a little bit about developer experience and the potential for better performance. And so I thought, well, what are the kind of the core tenets that come out of that idea? And I came up with 4. I'll say I continue to kind of waffle as I have these conversations like this, because I'm getting more and more input all the time that I really like. But what I've said is, 1, the UI is compiled, meaning it's decoupled. The front end's decoupled from the back end. That was number 2, is that the front end is decoupled. The first one, UI is compiled, so we're not rendering in real time. We've already got the code that we need at that time. Number 3 is that that code is served from a CDN, and then the fourth one is that the deployments are atomic. And I'll say that's the one that I feel today kind of iffy about. Like the more conversations I have, the more it feels like atomic deployments are they're kind of like a byproduct of taking that other 3, the approach of those other 3. And so to answer your second question, and does that fit the consensus definition? I don't think so. I think I'm motivated more to say, hey, if this thing that is the Jamstack is going to stick around, what I really want is a way to be able to describe it, not just as modern web development, but as one specific architectural pattern in this landscape that is modern web development, and to be able to introduce the nuance of all of the different approaches we take today, which unfortunately those don't really have buzzwordy names to go with them as well. So that's kind of where I am.
So from the beginning, at least personally, the term made me roll my eyes a lot, because I just felt like he was like, what rhymes with lamp? Jam. And it never made sense. It didn't. Like you were saying, everything was JavaScript APIs and markup, or at least 2 out of 3 of them, so how do you say that is Jamstack and that isn't? It became, and I think it was just like a cool term and easy to roll off the tongue type of term to describe a stack, like the next evolution or revolution in terms of a stack. And I think from that perspective, it's useful. It was good for branding, and it was good for creating some kind of more or less cohesive movement around this. And at the time, it really meant static site generation, which helped because then you could at least associate it with that. But as you all kind of described, it in itself has evolved to the point where even its own name stopped meaning what it meant, which I think removes a lot of the weight from the term. And so I know like saying modern web development is kind of just like meh. It's not very exciting. It's hard to get behind that. But I think that's where we're going, which is moving away from a particular stack and way of doing things that prevailed for a long time to promoting another way, which creates a better developer experience and in the end a better user experience. In terms of if we're going to say, okay, Jamstack still exists just for the sake of being able to give this very amorphous group a name, I think that there's 2 aspects to it. One is the process of creating a web app or a website that's Jamstack, and then the end result. And that's where I think people kind of fall into different camps. So, uh, from my perspective, which is not an objective perspective, Static is a Jamstack solution. We generate a static version of the site. We fully deliver it through a CDN. Things that Netlify kind of says, look, what's so cool that we have that we have preview static, we have SSL, we have full CDN, we have a lot of Lambda edge stuff happening. So if you just look at the end result, we're Jamstack. But I have a feeling that a lot of people would say we're not, because the origin is not a pure. If we were just using pure headless WordPress, then people would be like, okay, I could see that falling into this category. But we're not. The origin, the point of origin or the source of origin, or yeah, the point of truth is actually a regular WordPress site with a PHP theme and regular PHP LAMP stack functionality. And so then people want to kind of put us outside of that that group, which is fine. Like, people can put us wherever they want. I'm just saying that in terms of people's opinions and perspectives, it can go either way. What's the end result, and how did you generate that end result? And then that's how you fall into the Jamstack camp. So some people might say that static is, some people might say that it's not. But in the end, we're generating a static site. It's headless. It's decoupled, regardless of how it got there. And we're like a questionable in a questionable place there, which I think is interesting in some ways. So anyways, that's my perspective on Jamstack.
My definition is I would totally admit non-standard. It's a bit, reducing Jamstack to what is the minimum required to derive the benefits of Jamstack. And for me, that is really just two things. Data is being served from the edge as much as possible, and it's done in a way that empowers front-end developers. And that's because the CDN is the linchpin for a lot of the benefits of Jamstack that we talk about, whether it's security or scalability. It all tends to derive really from the CDN. And then the other part of this is it's usually done in a way that makes it easy for a front-end developer to leverage and reason about. So, static, is really a Jedi mind trick to get you to write your page in such a way that the CDN can serve it. But there's more than one way to get the data there. And another element of this is, if you look at something like incremental static generation, it's using, somewhat traditional CDN patterns, but it's doing it in a way that you're manipulating it as a front-end developer from within your React code. You're writing your basically Next.js code. And that's, again, front-end developer empowerment. So it's a reinvention of old primitives in new ways that make it easier for front-end developers. And serverless then would also fall into that, because it's scalability that a front-end developer would love because they don't have to worry about it. And so for me then, Jamstack's a spectrum, and it's basically a class of capabilities, and you could fall anywhere on that spectrum. But I'll readily admit something that I think we're all touching around, which is I think the term is going to be like HTML5 was a decade ago. It basically became an umbrella term that meant all modern web development. And at some point, it didn't distinguish from most web development to say you're doing HTML5, and it kind of effectively withered away and kind of won. Everything kind of ended up being like that. I think that's a model for what I expect will happen to the term eventually at some point.
Apologies in advance for this one, but I would not define it, because I don't think it has a definition, and I don't think the word has any value. It originally, as has been mentioned, was a marketing term that Netlify invented to represent websites that can be hosted on Netlify, and it remains tightly coupled to that. As such, as Netlify has changed its hosting platform, it has also pushed changes to the definition of the word itself, causing the confusion that results in panels such as these. It's also been mentioned earlier that the word itself doesn't really make any sense or hold any value from its definition. The acronym part that it was originally invented under is not helpful, was never helpful, and is now no longer accurate. It's not actually a stack in the way that people describe stacks such as lamp stack or mean stack. And it's constantly changing definitions. Nobody knows what it means. Here we are in a panel all debating what it means and throwing out different definitions for it. Overall, I just don't think this is a word that people should be using at all. If we want to make the web development community more accessible to people that are trying to get into this field, we shouldn't be espousing words that don't make any sense and don't really have a definition and nobody understands what they mean. We should be trying to use words that are clear and accessible and understandable by everybody who wants to get into the field. So my plea to anybody listening is don't use the word Jamstack, and please avoid the word because it just makes everything confusing and worse for everybody in this field and in this industry.
I mean, I know we talked about Netlify created the term, obviously. But having been around working in that community and with these tools at the time, I mean, the reason they came up with the term was there was a point to it, and it had to do with a number of things. I think, first of all, I can say having tried to sell companies on writing books about these tools and trying to sell my own companies on using the tools, that static sites was awful because you ended up in an extended discussion of why, well, can this actually handle what we want to build? It's like, well, yes, we can actually handle what you want to build. I mean, I know it says static sites, but it's not really static. We can do a lot, and so I struggled selling people on these solutions back in the early days. Jamstack kind of gave it, yes, it was a marketing term. I mean, like serverless is a marketing term. Like, I mean, any of these terms are marketing terms, right? Like we come up with names. Some of them lose their meaning, like HTML5, although that was not necessarily a marketing term. It was actually a spec. But like say even responsive web design now is kind of just web design. But it did help to define something that I could sell that didn't sound antiquated, number one. And number two, there was no community. We were very siloed. It was very much like, oh, I use Jekyll. I'm talking to people who use Jekyll. I use Hugo. I talk to people who use Hugo, but the community was very siloed. There was not a group of people who had, even though we had a lot of overlaying, like common problems we were trying to solve because the tools all had similarities and the process we were building sites was similar. Like those connections didn't exist. We all just existed within these siloed communities. And that's my worry about, say, the approach that you have, Jeff, which is just like describe what you build. It's like, well, we're building things 1,000 different ways, and then we lose that kind of intersection of where we have common approaches to different pieces of these applications where we can share solutions. I think having this kind of term helps to build a community around that we can work together. We have these. I mean, you're on the Slack communities where I know I've received a lot of help, and we have conferences, and we have and not just Netlify's conference. We have other events. We have books. It's a way to find your solutions. It helps people to define something that has some set of common problems that we're solving, and find those solutions as opposed to just I'm just looking in my tool, like I'm only talking to people in Next.js kind of thing. Even though my backend might have common problems with somebody who's doing Gatsby, as an example.
In a way, I feel like a lot of what Jamstack is going to be doing is becoming more normal, rather than, I'm not to say, like I said, I was very bad at realizing all the problems that could come up that people would have solved, and that's been beautiful. So I'm not good at seeing the future that way. But I do think that the next 5 years will mostly be bringing people into the field, making things easier to, get a full website up and going and that sort of thing. Whether that's, we've seen a lot of interesting tools like StackBit and Tina CMS coming along, and, editing interfaces just seems to be a never-ending problem to solve on the web. And now, when I first started looking at this, there were probably, other than maybe, some obscure, really high-end enterprise systems, but the headless CMS space, there were 3 players that I knew of. One of them is still, the dominant player, Contentful. But and now there's, there are countless of these, and so some of that will probably clear out. You can see where people are really innovating in that space, and there's open source tools and things like that. People are solving the problems of monetizing open source. So I feel like the next 5 years is more normalization and making things less niche,